The title of this video is Stuff Them Elegantly, and it will talk about the application portion of the law of retention. A quote has been said about Dr. Lola May, who is a mathematics educator. You may never have heard kids cheer when they solve a math equation or groan because a math lesson has come to an end unless you've witnessed Lola May teaching math. She was a pioneer mathematics educator, a consultant, and author. Famous for her ability to make speeches about math while receiving standing ovations, she made the hardest subject understandable to people of all ages. This quote on the right is her quote about teaching. Know your stuff, know whom you are stuffing, and stuff them elegantly. So the theme of this chapter is stuffing them elegantly. And in this retention method, there are 5 stages that can enable people to speed teach any subject. These are the 5 M's of law of retention. The first step is to prepare the material. The second is reduce it down to the minimum. Third is having the material be mind easy. Fourth, it is to memorize, and the fifth one is to master the subject. The first step is gathering the material. In gathering the material to be taught, there are 3 steps that can guide us. First is the overview of the subject. The purpose in overview is to get a bird's eye view of the content. This is the exposure stage where you start thinking in your mind the major sections of the material and how they might be arranged for a clear presentation. The second guideline for us is organize the subject. The purpose in organizing is to categorize your content into units of thoughts. It is helpful to construct a list of possible categories. Rank them in the order of importance. Items that must be required, items that are helpful but not required, all the way down to items that would not help and might even confuse the students when you teach it. The third guideline is to outline the subject. Here is where you would review all your categories and construct a logical order or presentation of them. By the end of the stage, you will have an initial broad outline of the material that you will be teaching to the. Once you have a general outline of the material, the next step is to reduce the content you have gathered and boil it down further to the irreducible minimum. This is like the cream of the crop, the most important content that you want all your students to know and memorize by heart. This step may seem unusual at first and a bit challenging to do, but it is a crucial step to effective instruction. This stage requires you to discard some of the work that you completed in the last stage, the material stage. And the idea behind this step is that not all your content is equally important. Most of it do not need to be memorized by your students. Some doesn't even need to be discussed. So now you ask, how do I do that? How do I choose which elements are most important? The author Wilkinson gave 3 things that will help to shape the material you need to include in your teaching outline. The first is the audience. The second is the time available to present. And the third is the purpose of the class. So these 3 things will help to shape the material and the outline you will have by the end of this stage. The book gave one example that I want to share with you today. So let's say the subject that you will be teaching on is on the life of Christ, and you will be teaching it to 3 different types of audiences: 6th grade girls, 25-year-old marrieds, and doctoral students in seminary. How successful would you be if you took the same approach for all 3 audiences? Not very much, I would think. So your selection of the material is determined by who your audience will be. Secondly, the time that you have will be a major role. You will pack very different content if the amount of time available is a 50-minute classroom hour versus a 13-week curriculum. And so thirdly, ask yourselves, what are you trying to accomplish with the students? What is the purpose? You would select different content if you were teaching the same book of the Bible, but with 3 different purposes. So if the first purpose is to survey the life of Christ, the second purpose is to prove that Jesus was the Messiah, or the third purpose is to respond to Jesus Christ in worship. These 3 are very different purposes, and your teaching material would be different according to which purpose that you would choose. After prioritizing your material based on these 3 shapers, you need to consider how well your students need to comprehend the material. Some of the questions that students can ask can be, do we have to know this? Is it enough to just know it, or do we need to memorize it? The law of retention insists that teacher is responsible for the following. What do the students need to know, and how well should they know it? Communicate it clearly to them. Do they need just surface awareness? Do they need average understanding, or do they need thorough comprehension? And your presentation of the selected information, present it in such a way that the students will learn it at the desired level. And thirdly, examine them on quizzes or tests on the agreed upon material and based on the correct level of comprehension that was communicated to them by the teacher. These irreducible minimums must be identified clearly and reviewed repeatedly. Everyone should master the irreducible minimum, or the teacher has not taught at the minimal level of performance. At this point, teachers, you have got the materials on hand that are most important and that the students must know by heart. It is now the time to choose the correct method to efficiently transfer it to their long-term memory. Do not fall into the trap that many teachers believe, that teaching is the presentation of facts by the teacher rather than the memorization of the facts by the students. You must carefully in this stage rearrange your material and simplify it. You mold and package the material until it slips into your student's mind. And to do this, mold the content so that it fits 2 key requirements. The first is easy to understand, and the second is easy to memorize. Master teachers take the most difficult concepts and make them so simple that even children can understand. It is true that some concepts can be more difficult to grasp than others, but that doesn't mean the master teacher cannot develop his lesson in such a skillful manner that the class not only follows and understands, but they also know it is being taught. They are being taught a complex concept. Take the example of Lola May that I shared with you in the beginning of the video. I cannot imagine a lecture about a math concept can receive such a standing ovation from the audience. Nor do I imagine a class of 7th, 8th graders groan when the class was over because they were so engaged with the teacher and the material. She was able to make her subjects easily understandable, fun, and engaging at the same time. As for the degree of memorability, the more difficult it is to memorize, the less memorability it has. The easier to memorize, the better the learning. So don't expect the mind to receive facts that have no logic or order. One of the ways that you can help contents stick into the memory through representing the facts in a picture. If you give me a picture of the New York Twin Tower, I can recall exactly where I was and what I was doing on that day on 9/11/2001 during the attack. I was in my high school in my 10th grade science class, and the teacher just decided to turn on the TV and have the whole class watch this act of terrorism that was going on that day. So pictures stimulate within us a flood of memories. God Himself uses pictures such as rainbow, fish, and a cross to remind His people of His promise and who they were. Another effective way to transfer facts in teaching, preaching, or in normal conversation is through telling a story. Think back to the last sermon you hear, or maybe the last few women's seminar that you've attended. Do you remember the 3 points or 5 points of the lesson that they gave? Most likely we forgot it already. But for me, what I do remember is the personal story that is told during that session or the testimony. For instance, I remember Janet's testimony of the fear she had when she had to move to a new country, but how good and faithful God was to carry her through those difficult times. And I remember Mirari's testimony of how being a mother, career woman, and an editor made her busy, but that many times that busyness was not productive, but instead it was draining if her day started off with not communing with God from the morning. So don't underestimate the power of stories, illustrations, and parables. It can be powerful tools to make facts stick in a person's mind. Another method that is widely used to make memory retention easier is the use of alphabets and mnemonics. It is helpful because it creates order and logic from disjointed pieces of information. And by arranging these facts in order, it will be easier for the students to memorize. If you remember these, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally for the order of math equation that we learned when we were in elementary school, or the colors of the rainbow, Roy G. Biv. Those are the famous mnemonics that we know of. Now that you've done all the preparation work prior to class from step 1 to 3, from gathering the materials using the 3 guidelines of overviewing the subject, organizing it, and outlining it, and then in step 2 you've boiled it down to the minimum that the students must know by heart and memorize, and then the third is that you've repackaged and thought about a way that you have to clearly made the material easy for the students to understand and memorize. Make the commitment in this stage to do whatever it takes for your students to memorize the facts necessary for every quiz and test. The focus of this step is on transferring those contents, transferring it to the student's mind. The goal of the law of retention is to enable your students to memorize the material you have identified as essential. Many teachers wrongly believe they must spend all of their time giving out new materials every class time, or they are wasting their students' time. But this is simply not true. The more we repeat something, the more it will stick to our memory. Therefore, do whatever it takes for your students to memorize those facts. And the key to memorization is review. When reviewing, make sure the students adequately understands the material. Because review is only effective when they all understood what they are memorizing for. Review should be practiced in the same order with the same words until fully memorized. And thirdly, it should be done frequently in the beginning, but spaced less and less as time passes. And lastly, it should also be done using a variety of methods. From the start of class, you have begun this process by leading your students from a total lack of knowledge of a subject to memorizing the irreducible minimum. And now in this fifth step, it is moving them towards mastering the material. The purpose of this stage is to move the class from acquiring information to applying the information and possibly leading them to independent proficiency. What this means is the aim of teaching is to help the students sense how these facts can be used in areas beyond their immediate context and apply them to the real world. So not only does the student need to memorize and comprehend the subject, if you are teaching for life change, then integration and utilization in the real world should be present as well. If a student has learned the material so thoroughly, he couldn't help but use it in his own life, even without the pressure from the teacher. And this is ultimately the real goal of all education. Let's quickly recap the steps that we have learned so far. First is to prepare the material by organizing the subject and outlining it. Then the next is to boil it down to the minimum, getting to the essence of your material that the students need to know. And then the third one is to choose a method that is mind easy to help the students easily slip the rearranged and simplified package into their minds. The fourth is continuous review so that the irreducible minimum is memorized. And the fifth one is to move the students to mastery of the subject.